Welcome to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking about politics. I'm your host, Randy Lioz. Today, I'm talking to a guest who's engaged in the work of bridge building in a fascinating way. His name is Aziz Abu Sarah, and he's created a travel company called Mejdi Tours, Mejdi meaning both honor and respect in Arabic, I believe, that specializes in guided travel in conflict zones, places where there are groups that have existed in often violent opposition to one another, like Israel and the Palestinian territories, Northern Ireland, Colombia, the Baltic region. And they have some really fascinating ways of helping people understand these places from multiple perspectives. So Aziz, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Randy. I'm happy to be with you.
Absolutely. And so you and I got to chat a bit yesterday. And one of the values that I think that our organizations share most deeply is a focus on the importance of stories in helping people understand one another's journeys to our perspectives in the world, right? So and I think that your story is really compelling in terms of how you came to this work. So I wanted to give you a chance to talk about that.
Yeah, I did not grow up as somebody who believed in hearing the other side or multiple narratives, dialogue at all. I grew up in Jerusalem, very, very rough childhood. I think I was 7 or 8 years old first time I was shot at. So the idea of dialogue was not something I've even considered back then. My brother was killed by Israeli soldiers when I was 10. So I grew up very angry, very bitter, very much, with this idea or belief that revenge is the only path forward. And I had a major change when I was 18 years old, when I went to study Hebrew for the first time in West Jerusalem, which is only, I was walking distance from my house, but never had that opportunity before. And that meeting the other and starting conversations, it changed my perception of what's us and what's them really is, and realizing that us and them can be very different. Israelis, Jews, and the other side are not necessarily the them. And if anything, we can be us together. We can be working together on bringing justice, bringing peace, bringing security to everyone instead of being against each other.
Yeah. And, there's a multiple narrative approach that underpins a lot of your tours. And I really wanted to hear more about that, really focusing on the idea of storytelling and how that connects people. So what does that multiple narrative approach consist of? How do you execute that?
Yeah, I think, across that right away in my Hebrew class. It was through talking to each other, telling each other stories that we got to overcome our enmity. Because if you right away put people in a box and say you're Israeli, you're Palestinian in this case, and in many, I've worked in over 60 countries, and many of the places I've traveled to, if you tell people, if we right away try to box people into where they are politically, religiously, all of that, you just can't have a dialogue. It's impossible. But the moment you start sharing stories and talking to each other and hearing where people coming from, what moves them, what changed them, what inspires them, that is very different. You humanize the other. That we often, when especially in areas where we see some conflict, we often see the other as a demon, we dehumanize them. And so that the stories make you understand each other much more, makes you empathize with the other, make you feel their pain. And I've seen that just so many times in every place I've traveled to, where people are so stuck to their story, to their narrative, and then they start hearing somebody else's story, and you can see the softening of the heart. You can see the softening on their faces, where suddenly there's a smile. Suddenly they're like, wait, he's not as bad. She's not as bad as I thought they are. So yeah, stories are very, very important, and definitely in travel. One of my favorite quotes is, travel makes you speechless, and then it turns you into a storyteller. And in some ways, conflict resolution, peace building, dialogue, it's all travel. It's traveling from your comfort zone into somewhere that's scary to you, into a new area, into new knowledge that you didn't have before. And that makes you a storyteller. That opens a whole other dimensions that you did not think about before.
Yeah, and so the speakers and the folks who are sharing their perspectives on these tours, where do they come from in the communities? How do you find them? How do you connect with them? And I also am very curious about the dynamic that exists between folks who are sharing different perspectives on these tours. Does there ever arise conflict between them because of their different perspectives, or does it tend to be that they just have a focus on a different aspect of whatever site that they're looking at, or historical event that they're talking about?
Right. So I started Majdi with a Jewish friend of mine. So the whole concept of the company was a Palestinian and a Jew. People didn't think these two can work together. If you look around the world, unfortunately, very few joined businesses like this. We are a B Corp as well, an organization that exists. And I remember when we started, everyone we knew said, this is the dumbest idea you can do. Who's going to want to go and see two people fighting with each other who are supposed to be guiding you, and then meet all these people who have different opinions? People travel for fun. They don't travel to learn. That's what I was told. It's absolutely not true. People do want to travel and learn. People want to, and especially when we travel, we're more willing to hear a different story. We do stupid things sometimes we would never do at home when we are traveling. We'll try food we'd never try maybe at home when we're traveling. So there's some kind of openness that if we can use while people traveling, we can bring some kind of understanding that never happens before. So that starts with our travelers that are more open. With the tour guides, if anything, it's the opposite. You bring an Israeli and a Palestinian, a Catholic and a Protestant. You bring a Muslim and a Christian, a Serb and a Bosnian, and the assumption is they're going to start fighting. Now, that almost never happens. Yeah, they disagree. They have debates here and there, but in many cases, it creates friendships, like very, very deep friendships, because they're going through a process themselves. As they're going through guiding this group, they're learning about each other. They're learning about who's this person who's traveling with me, their stories. If you have in Israel and Palestine, you have Hussam who starts talking about being shot one time and how that affected him. Or you have Yuval, who when he wanted to get married, asked this Palestinian tour guide, Hussam, to come and officiate his wedding, because they were guiding together for so long. They've become good friends, even though they're on the tour. They have debates and they argue and they talk, but they've built a very close relationship. You have an Israeli who will come and say, yeah, I served in the Israeli army, and you have a Palestinian who will say, to me, the Israeli army is oppressive. And they talk about that. Why did you go serve in the army? Well, why do you see us as oppressive? And go back and forth. And for the travelers, they get to hear something they would never have heard otherwise. And it doesn't matter how progressive I am or how progressive one of the tour guides is, they'll never give the two perspectives in a faithful way, the same way as hearing two people talking. With the other speakers, we try to diversify the narratives as much as possible. So we reach out to people who can really give a good perspective on different elements of wherever we are, not just conflict. It's important to say it's also cultural, it's also art, it's those things. So people don't understand the place they're going to as only one-dimensional. And there's a little bit of politics in everything, even art and in culture and so on. But for example, when we go to Ireland, storytelling and ancient storytelling is a big part. So we'll bring people who tell these old stories. When you go to Jerusalem, you go and have a dinner with a Palestinian family and you have a dinner with a Jewish family. When we go to Egypt, we spend time with a Christian Coptic community, because so many people go to Egypt don't even realize that 10-15% of Egypt are Christians, and hear about, are there issues, are there conflicts, what about the stuff we hear in the news about Christians being persecuted in the Middle East, where that's true, where that's not maybe true. Hear it from people who live there, who have different perspectives and the same issue as well. When you go to Serbia and Bosnia, the same thing. Meeting with, I think just giving people a voice is something they're not often used to. So it's not so hard to recruit and find the people to come and speak, because they often don't have that voice. They nobody invites them to tell those stories. And we're trying to just provide a platform. And then our travelers, I think, trust us a lot more, that we're not hiding anything. I'll bring you the good, the bad, and the ugly, and we'll have a good discussions about it. We're not trying to push a propaganda. We want you to hear the narratives and to have better understanding wherever you go.
Yeah, we had touched a little bit on intergroup contact theory, and the question of how much structure that is really required to offer a really good experience, a productive experience, when two groups come together and share their narratives, or a third group is listening to those narratives, and you want them to do so with an open mind. I'm wondering how much prep that you have to do at the beginning of the tour to really help the tourists, and also the guides and the other speakers get into the right frame of mind about the perspectives that they're sharing.
Yeah, so we work with the tour guides. We don't match tour guides who don't know each other, never worked together, never met, because that could end up not a good experience eventually. You want them to meet before, you want them to know each other before. We often ask all our tour guides who are new to shadow a trip before they lead a trip themselves. And they have questions. They get to try to work as they are shadowing the trip. They get to speak sometimes. They get to see the interactions. How do you deal with things that might be emotionally hard for you to talk about? How do you communicate that to the other guide? So that's the preparations when it comes to the guides. And when they come together and start working, it is not, they know what to expect. And in many cases, every guides the night before they will talk every day, because the tours are multi days, 10 days, 7 days, so on. So every night they'll meet after, talk about how the day was, what went well, what maybe they could do better, and usually what is it that we're going to do tomorrow, how can we improve. It's also reading the group. What's amazing, these trips cannot be really scripted, because depending on what group you have and what's interesting for that group, the guides often change a lot of what the conversation is going to be about. If you have a group that's more interested in certain political conversations, you move toward that. If you have them more interested in religious issues, you move toward that. If you have them more interested in racial issues, you talk more about that. And so they have to communicate every day about how are we going to meet the needs of this group and have the conversations that they are interested in. With the travelers, it's a challenge sometimes, because what we try to say, you cannot judge a trip by the first day. When you have multiple narratives, some days will lean more toward one or the other narratives, and it's okay. You have to look at the trip as a whole. And if I'm leading the trip, the way I start it is, I want you to know there'll be different narratives. There'll be some you will disagree with. Please take it in. Please think about it. Breathe in, even the ones that are hard for you to take. You will hear counter narratives. And it's not going to happen at the same moment always. And the guides are not going to try to debunk anything 5 minutes after a speaker spoke, because that's not fair. And that's not the way we want to do it. They'll give it some time. They want you to think about it. And then later on, yes, you can have conversations and have opinions, and the guides will tell you even what they think. They're not going to do it on the spot. Please don't disrespect any speaker, regardless how much you disagree with them. And if you give it enough time, you will hear different narratives. It's just not going to be ping pong all the time. That's not the goal of this. It's not going to be, remember that show Crossfire back in the days? It's not going to
Indeed.
be like that. It's not like a theatrical, let's argue with each other in a theatrical kind of setting. We
Right.
want a real experience, not the theatrical aspect. And in 99.9%, it works incredibly well. We don't get travelers who only from the same political point of views. We get people from very different political point of views.
Mhm.
And it is so rare to get a complaint about this trip is too biased
Mm.
this way or that way. So which we take a lot of pride in, that we try so hard to provide. It doesn't mean it doesn't present different aspects that can be seen as biased, but presents all aspects of it. And to us, that's very important.
Right. Yeah. It seems like while you're not trying to create debates between, the people who are presenting, the tour guides, and even the travelers, it does seem that like you're leaning into the idea of it being a conversation, a very responsive conversation, right? And for us, that is so central that when people are practicing the art of listening, that they're really coming to focus on the values and the important issues for whoever they're speaking with. And it sounds like your guides are trying to be as responsive as possible to the values and the experiences of the travelers who are on these tours, because that's the only way that you really can connect, that you can make them really fully engaged in the story of the place that you're looking at. So that sounds fantastic. It really does sound like it creates an engaging experience for everyone, that regardless of where they've come from beforehand, right? They can find something to latch onto and engage with
Yeah,
on these tours.
absolutely. And one thing I have to always add, because people assume these kind of trips are not fun.
Hmm.
And it is so not true. One, meeting people, exploring, trying different foods, trying different cultures, really be immersed is a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And the other hand, it doesn't mean you don't do some other kind of touristy stuff. You can do both at the same time. And it's one of the main questions I often get, like, oh, am I going on this trip and I'm gonna just need a vacation after a vacation kind of thing? Like, no, that's not true. You're still gonna see some cool stuff. You're still gonna experience amazing food, but you're also gonna have a meaningful experience that hopefully will help you see a part of the world or rethink about relationships, how people encounter each other and who the other is. When I take people to the Middle East, there's so many stereotypes about the Middle East, so many stereotypes. And I'm always amazed how within a day or two, you can see those stereotypes falling and you can see people reflecting. People who came from certain political views that maybe made them assume everybody in the Middle East must be a terrorist and must be violent and must be every woman in the Middle East is oppressed. And I remember taking a group to Oman, one of the countries in the Middle East, and I was with them. We went to a mosque, met with a woman after who said, if you have any questions about Islam, you can ask me. And we had this incredible conversation. And she was a very feisty, strong lady.
Yeah.
And we leave, and one of the women came to me crying, literally in tears, saying, that is totally not the image I had of any Muslim woman. A strong, powerful, very eloquent, beautiful, all of these things that she's like, that's not the image I've seen on TV. That's not the image I've heard. And she was an older lady, and she's like, for 60, 70 years, never even thought of challenging that stereotype. And it was on a trip where she met one of these women that made her think, okay, the image I have, it can be partially true, but it's not fully true.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like there's a lot of really meaningful relationships that are built on these tours. Is there a way that you foster the ability for people to keep up those relationships and even use them to take action in their own communities and dispel some of the stereotypes that they had held onto?
We do and we don't. So we try to be careful because we're not an advocacy company organization. So we trying to be careful to say we want you to be involved at home. We want you to take this experience. We want the relationship to continue. In many cases, it does. We do podcasts, live streams like we are doing here, and bring people together, and we have conversations. And the same people end up going with us to other areas as well. Our repeat travelers it's a significant number, but we don't get too political in the sense you have to do this. I stay in relationship, I know, on a personal level with so many of the people who've traveled with us, and to me it's amazing watching them and see their lives changing. People who, especially the younger groups, students who come on a trip and leave, say, this will change the way I'm thinking of my future. A student who decided to go into studying human rights after the trip. A student who went to work for the United Nations after. Few students who went into politics after this trip. In this recent cycle, one student, still in their 20s, one already in a state assembly, and one she's just in her early 30s, is a judge now in her state. Like, it's incredible to me seeing people who come on these trips and how it stays with them, and this experience become part of who they are.
Yeah. One of the things that I was really interested about in terms of your experiences with the travel, and especially in places, in other places in the world that have had deep conflict, that we've seen the path that they have followed. There was one example in particular in Northern Ireland that I've been thinking about, and you have done tours there, and I was wondering about parallels that can speak to the path that we're on in the U.S. right now. Some people have raised the prospect of us entering a civil war, and when I looked at the conflict in Northern Ireland and the gradually escalating violence that they experienced there, I was wondering, is that an indicator of where we might actually be headed in this country? Do you want to speak to that, or some of the other examples that you've seen around the world, and how we can learn from them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Northern Ireland is a perfect example, and our tour guides feel the same way about it. That the experts we hire there feel exactly the same way, is that there's so many similarities between Northern Ireland and between the United States. And on the tour, this is a conversation, because many of our travelers are from the United States. On the tours we're running there, this is a very present conversation. As you're going to where Bloody Sunday happened, and we talk about how violence kept, like you said, it started smaller and smaller, and eventually one major event led to the break of violence that took years to be able to bring down, and still not fully solved. It's still an issue that Northern Ireland is dealing with it. So we talk about violence, we talk about demonization, we talk about news and how media bias has affected people, and misleading news have affected people's perception of the other. We talk about division, the peace wall, for example, where eventually people stopped going to the same schools, they stopped going to the same bars and pubs and restaurants, and eventually no connection. We create echo chambers, and I only hear the people who agree with me, and you only hear the people who agree with you. And these are all very similar things that we are going through today in the United States. But it also gives us a little bit of, hopefully, a way to learn how to not get to where Northern Ireland got. And that also is a big part of the conversation. And it always becomes one of the most important points on the tours. And from the travelers I've seen travel to Northern Ireland, this is usually their takeaway. And I can probably find something where one of them sent me a message saying this was one of the best trips they've gone on in their lives, because the conversation was not just about Northern Ireland, it was about what can we learn from this conversation back home? How can we adapt in our own community? And the amazing part, I don't have to tell them this is what you should do. They themselves take it because of the trip and the relationships. One of them just called me actually recently and said she's inviting our tour guide in Northern Ireland to come and speak in a conference here in the US on this issue exactly, is what can we learn from Northern Ireland in the US. So these kind of conversations definitely always happening.
Wow, yeah. In those sorts of conflicts, it seems like one of the common themes that we see is the enforcement of group loyalty, where basically interacting with the other group even is seen as an act of disloyalty. And so they are putting up walls and in both physically and metaphorically in so many ways. And we seem to be doing something similar in this country where if you give credence, if you give time to the other perspective, it is seen as a betrayal to your core group. And because of the tribal nature of human beings and how we developed as a species and as societies, being cast out of your core group is one of the most dangerous things that could happen to us, right? And so I guess it brings up the question, like, how do we prevent those walls from being erected? And how do we encourage people to, rather than cutting off ties, to keep up that communication and just to be, and it doesn't even have to be communication necessarily about the core issues, right? It can just be, being adjacent to one another and living together in a way that we can see that our lives are similar, our challenges are similar, and often our values are similar.
That's one of the biggest challenges I think we have anywhere there's a conflict, because the way you keep a conflict alive and a conflict going is by segregating communities and make them unable to speak to each other, make it betrayal to talk to the other. I can tell you from Jerusalem, Israel, and Palestine, this is very, very big thing. If you're a Palestinian talking to Israelis, your community will call you a normalizer, a person who's accepting injustice. If you're an Israeli talking to a Palestinian, you're also a traitor, you Arab lover and hate your own community, and you self-hating Jews suddenly. And that does affect a lot of people who don't want to be ostracized from their own community. You see it in Northern Ireland as well. You see it in the Balkans. You see it. Balkans used to be a place where interfaith marriages was such a normal thing. Today, that's not a normal thing. Actually, you still go to Mostar, same school is segregated. The Catholic kids, Christian kids studying alone, the Muslim kids studying alone in the same school. It's happening. So how do we break away from that? I think there are a few things. One, people themselves start believing all these dehumanized versions, and sometimes you need a shocking news, something to break through to the norm to make people rethink where they stand on these issues. And I can think of a few examples here. One of them is maybe one of my favorites. My dad, when I became into peace work, was not very excited about it. He had multiple family members, cousins killed. His son was killed. He had more than one cousin actually killed by either soldiers or in the war or by radicals, Israeli radicals. So he did not enjoy this change I had at all. And at one point, I invited him to come to an event I was organizing. I was at that time leading an organization called Bereaved Families Forum, people who lost family members in the conflict. And he came mainly because I made him. And he sat there. I'm like, I'm speaking at the event. I want you to be there. But as soon as we did some event and they asked if anybody had a question, he raised his hand. which I knew was going to be a disaster because he comes from exactly that point of view,
Yeah.
the other. And his question was about the Holocaust, which is a topic you don't want to bring in unless you know a little bit about it. My dad knew nothing. So his question was very, in many ways, disrespectful, unacceptable. And he asked, did the Holocaust really happen? Is it really as big as you say it is, or did they make it bigger because of political reasons? Israel government uses it to gain sympathy. He had all these things. And you had a room of 200 people. You could hear a drop of a pen. And then you have me running the show, and I'm like, I don't know this man. He's not my dad. I'm like getting out of the room, like,
Right.
you, whoever called on him, you deal with this. I'm not dealing with it. But it was a powerful moment because one of the members in the Israeli side, his father was in Auschwitz before. And he stood up and said, you know what? I don't expect you to know something you have never learned about. I don't want you to just believe because I tell you to believe, because you think I'm cool. I want you to learn about it. So let me have my dad, the Auschwitz survivor, take you to the Holocaust Memorial himself, and he will give you a tour and tell you his personal story. It will be something personal, not just a normal, tour at the museum. And my dad agreed, but something very powerful ended up happening. Not only my dad agreed, 70 other Palestinians said, we know nothing about the Holocaust Museum. We know nothing about the Holocaust. These are all 70 people who lost family members, who were killed by Israeli soldiers in most cases. And so these people went there, and it was a big story. It was a shocking story for many Israelis. It was the biggest delegation of Palestinians going to learn about the Holocaust, not just any Palestinians, people who lost family members. And it's those kind of stories that kind of break through the negative news of the other, that shows you, no, whoever's standing on the other side isn't your enemy. And the results of this one stupid question that my dad asked, not only the 70 Palestinians going, then a group of Israelis said, we want to learn about Palestinian history. And this happened about 15, 16 years ago. There's a project happening today, still in Jerusalem, that every year brings groups of Israelis and Palestinians to learn each other's history. Very powerful thing, but it starts with honesty, say where we don't know, but also this element of doing something that might shock the other side, something they did not even expect it to happen, that makes them go, okay, maybe. The other part is what you mentioned earlier, storytelling. Mm-hmm. We started with that. I walked into classrooms in different parts of the world, but probably the most powerful is the ones in Jerusalem, Jewish schools or Palestinian schools. And I would go there with an Israeli person who also lost their family members in their family. And almost every one of those classes, we would walk in and none of the students wanted to talk to us. You ask them what their opinion of the other side, and in almost all cases, it'll be all hardcore negative. Enemy, hate them, don't want them, I don't want to hear this conversation. An hour later, as we tell our stories, a complete change, because we're not trying to argue with them politics. We're not trying to tell them where they're right and wrong politically. We're just telling them our stories. And if I'm in an Israeli school, they ignore the Israeli guy. They have only questions for me because they've never met a Palestinian before, and they want to know so many things. And if I'm in a Palestinian school, they ignore me and talk only to the Israeli guy, who to them represent everything about Israel and Judaism and so on. Those opportunities to tell a story, to humanize the other, not just argue politics, I think that's how we kind of break away from those elements of you can't talk to the other.
Right. Yeah. You have worked so often with groups of bereaved families that have been very directly affected by these conflicts. And, it brings to mind the idea that a lot of groups involved in conflict really feel strongly that there is an asymmetry there, that they have been victimized more so by the other group, and I certainly wonder how it impacts their receptiveness to bridging divides. When you were talking about the question about the Holocaust, I've been involved in several conversations recently about so I come from a Jewish background, and when Jews are seeing things in prominent media that is bringing up the idea of questioning the Holocaust. So most recently, Kyrie Irving's sharing that video that did engage in Holocaust denialism, and but really focuses on the perceived imbalance of power between the Black community or Black communities and Jewish communities, especially based on the role that Jews often play in certain industries, where we have engaged in middleman roles very often, and so we are not necessarily the talent in the sports or the entertainment industry, but we are agents or executives, and there is this perception of victimization, and so it's a really complex dynamic there, and it can be really difficult to ask a group that feels that they have been victimized to be open to the perspective of the other side. So I definitely want to hear your perspective on how to deal with those perceptions of the asymmetry, and people's general attitudes when they feel like they are on the losing end of an exchange. And go ahead and unmute.
I'm muted myself, sorry. Man, that's a story too. There are very different elements I want to mention here. One, I fully agree, and it is very painful, very hard. Denial of somebody else's pain is probably one of the hardest things for someone to take, even when you are into peace and dialogue and all of that. It hits you very hard. And I've been there. Many of my Israeli partners I've worked with, Jewish partners, when we go into these schools, we've got people who told us those things. In my experience, though, and I know it's very hard, arguing against it and trying to fight the person who's saying it has never worked. And I know it's very hard to say that, because, like I said, I've been there. I've been in a place where people say your pain doesn't matter. Your brother probably deserved to be killed, like things like that. And I realize if I shoot back and say, you stupid, you ignorant, you racist, even though they might be all true, it didn't win anybody over. And it definitely didn't win the people who are listening to him over, even if you can't win that person. Right. I remember meeting with a guy named Daryl Davis. I'm sure you've come across Daryl. And I've asked him that question before, because he talks a lot about having dialogue with people who exactly do what we're talking about. And he said, I let them talk. I let them tell me everything, all the stereotypes, all the awful things they have about me. And then after a couple hours of them unloading everything negative you can even imagine, I say, can I now talk? And I try to tell them, again, my story instead of arguing with them and trying to get to their heart, not to their mind, because they're going to start like, well, prove to me and bring me something. You can bring them all the evidence on earth. It will not change their mind. Something has to move beyond evidence, and often it's the heart. And so he's like, I let them talk. And then I say, can I speak after you finish? Give me 15 minutes after you're done telling me all the awful things you want to tell me. and that does speak to them. That eventually works sometimes, maybe not always. I think of somebody like another person who I met with, Daryl Arno Michaelis, who was a white supremacist. And he told me a story of being in a McDonald's and using all his money usually and getting drunk and doing all the awful things. And he said he once did a swastika tattoo on his finger. And he went to McDonald's and was a black lady working there. And because she treated him usually nice, he felt awful showing her. So he kept hiding his hand. And eventually one day she saw it. And he expected her to yell at him, which gives him then the chance to yell back. He said instead, she looked at him and she said, I know you. I know you are better than this. And it's like that I didn't know what to do with. And I went out running away from the place, and it stayed with him. Didn't change him immediately, but stayed with him for years, and eventually was one of the reasons he now works to help other people to leave these kind of hate groups. So I look at these people and how successful they were with being patient, with trying to engage constructively, telling stories. And I think, again, it's painful, it's hard, but that's the way. I also think on the pain aspect, your pain will always feel more to you than mine, even if yours is less than mine. Like if objectively, whatever that means, is less. Like if somebody shoots the two of us and shoots you in your finger and shoots me in my head, your finger will hurt more than my head to you because it's yours. And so this comparing pain and how who suffered more and who's a victim more, that's what keeps us in this cycle of violence and hate. Oh, my pain, you did this to me, I did this to you. Pain is pain. It doesn't matter how big or how small it is. We all in some ways have been victims to certain things, and we can't argue whose pain is bigger. I don't think it ever leads to anything positive.
Yeah. An idea that I engaged with a few years ago. So Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, was, formative for me in terms of my thinking. And one of the ideas that he pointed out was that in major conflicts, where there was a major imbalance between two groups, the only way to get past that conflict and really achieve reconciliation, he was talking about societies like South Africa and Rwanda, is for at least one group to start off accepting the idea that there will never be necessarily perfect justice, because that justice often to many people involves retribution, and that feeds a cycle, and it makes the conflict unending. And so, I love that idea. Yeah.
Have you come across Rwanda? Rwanda had restorative justice, and some agree with it more than others. It's always subject for debate. But what they did is, and I think that's what happened in South Africa too, it's restorative justice, meaning, yeah, you're not going to put to prison everyone who's done something. And it's, again, very hard. Reconciliation, a part of letting go, sometimes forgiveness, which again is very, very difficult, plays with it. But in Rwanda, they basically, every town would make this gathering, and people who've committed crimes would come forward and tell their crime, and the town would sentence them to do something good for this community. And it could be help build a school, it could be help do something good. But they had to come and ask for forgiveness. They had to come and share what they did and admit the wrongs they've done, basically. Those meetings were very, very difficult to happen. But I think the society realized you can't hang everyone. You're going to end up killing half of the country again if you do that. And yes, there were heavy, heavy crimes. And I the person who killed my brother never went to jail. Never. I don't know who he is. And I can't, and I know I'll never get justice in the sense of that person going to prison. And it hurts lots that this person's having a normal life. And yet me sticking to being angry and to wanting that kind of revenge makes me a slave to this person. Mm-hmm. Makes him not only kill my brother, but also kill my life. And that's what I realized when I was 18 years old and had to learn to let go of my anger, is that person didn't only kill my brother, he's killed a lot more than that and controlled my life and my family's life. Because when you're bitter, when you're angry, that's not a life to live. That's not something we want to have. And realizing that has helped me let go. Has helped me. It's still painful. It still hurts. My mom still, this happened 30 years ago with my brother. When I go with my mom to the graveyard and we go visit my brother's tomb, she still cries like he was killed yesterday. But there's no hate. Mm-hmm. There is no, I want to kill somebody else because you've killed my brother. And I think that's the part where victimhood, the difference between being a victim and being a survivor. I think we all have reasons. You're coming from Jewish background. I'm sure you have a reason. A lot of Jews have been driven out of their homes, whether it's in the pogroms in Russia or in Germany or so on. You have a reason to feel a victim because your family have gone through it. I have a reason to feel a victim. Many people in the US have reasons to feel victims. But I think we need to learn to become survivors and not only victims. Doesn't mean we don't work to correct the wrongs that's happening today. And there are many, but we do that by becoming survivors. And the difference is victims feel everything is against them. They feel there are walls kind of around them. Every narrative is against them. The whole world is against them. And it's hard to overcome that. While survivors try to find a narrative through all of that, a way out, and try to build alliances, try to build relationships, try to tell the story, try to find hope. And that's the difference. And that's the path I try to choose. And again, it is very, very hard, but it's more fulfilling and it makes my life much better.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's such a powerful idea, but as you say, it is a very difficult journey to get to that idea and to really internalize it and use it to push your narrative forward, right? I definitely want to talk about the tours that you're doing in the US in Washington, D.C. What can people expect to experience from that kind of tour?
So same as we do in some of the other destinations I mentioned, we have two tour guides, one progressive, one conservative, and they're not fighting the whole time. I say we try not to do theater, but I remember the first trip we ran, I went to the two tour guides halfway through the trip and I said, "You're agreeing way too much, man. You need a little bit of disagreements." But that's a beautiful thing. When we start talking about issues, we realize that differences are not as big as we watch on TV. And so we have these tour guides. Depending on the tour, we have different kind of tours we're running there, but you're going to some of the important places that maybe you've been to DC, whether it's the the memorials like the Lincoln Memorial or the Korea War or the Jefferson Memorial, but then try to see each memorial and its legacy from different perspectives, different backgrounds. How does a progressive, a Democrat maybe see it? How does a Republican, a conservative person see it? And when you talk about Lincoln, ends up being a very interesting conversation about Democrats becoming Republicans, Republicans becoming Democrats, politically speaking, changing positions on issues. When we go to the Vietnam or to the Korea War memorials, you start talking about foreign affairs and how each community, each group sees our involvements around the world, military, non-military, aid to other countries, so on. This becomes a part of the conversation. So you're not only saying, oh, this war happened, you try to look at the implications of what's our foreign policy from both perspectives. And then when you go to MLK Memorial, the same conversations about civil rights and how the United States dealt with it and how is it today. Go to places like um, I'm trying to remember suddenly, Anacostia in DC, a very African American a neighborhood that's being gentrified, talking about gentrification, talking about we go visit some museums around there. We go visit a church, for example, talk to a pastor, talk about the role of faith in politics in the US, meet some progressive or conservative organizations, anything. We've met with Heritage Foundation, for example, and talked about how conservatives see certain aspects of in that meeting. We talked about DC vote, whether people in DC have the right to vote or not the right to vote, which was a fascinating conversation. But even just being able, and I remember at the end, every conversation we walked out when we met someone, people walked out saying, oh, that's a perspective I never heard before. And you think, we watch so much television, we hear so many about what the other think, and yet there are so many meetings we would walk out of and hear, oh, I never thought about that. This was never shared. And when you see the two tour guides interacting, the fact they're interacting, liking each other, not fighting, not yelling at each other, that in itself is a huge victory and makes people realize, oh, we can have those conversations. We don't need to always make it so like, oh, you can never talk about politics, you can never talk about religion, if you want to be friends, that's the way to do it, Thanksgiving dinner. No, you can. It's about how we talk about it, not can we talk about it or not. So it's a lot, to me, it's a lot of fun as well, because you're learning about the United States, you're learning how to have those conversations. We are not sitting in a conference room the whole time. We're going from one place to another. Some conversations get more stimulation from the audience than others. I think especially faith and race issues, those end up being, after the meetings we have usually at churches, you have really good discussions with the group, and there's usually more emotions, and that's fine, that's good. So it's a lot of fun, and I hope to, well, you're in DC now, so I think
it's not yet. So I'm actually in
will you be there in March?
The act of planning my move. I'm hoping it'll happen within the first couple months of the new year, and I'm incredibly excited. I mean,
March. We have a trip in March. Let's.
It would be incredible to be able to join you for that. DC is a place that has always had a strong pull for me. So my brother lives there with his family, and I have aunt and uncle and cousins who live there. So many friends and colleagues, of course, with Braver Angels, and so it is just a really exciting prospect of being able to really connect with those people, and the idea of connecting with your tours, I mean, sounds really phenomenal. The experience that you mentioned that people have, where it really mirrors a lot of people's experience, I think, with our Red Blue workshops, because so I facilitated a lot of those and been involved in so many, and at each one, someone says at the end, well, we are so much closer and have so much more in common than I had realized. And it's continually heartening in the work that we do, even though it's a very challenging work, right? In some of the same ways that you've been talking about your journey, and really reconciling my loyalties to folks who think the same way that I do, and my strong desire to protect people who I feel have been victimized in a lot of ways. But being able to lay that feeling aside and still reach across is so incredibly powerful. And we know that when people do that, they wind up feeling so much better about the state of things and the potential that we have to work together. So that's really exciting. I definitely can't wait to engage with that stuff.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to finding more and more ways to do more of this stuff together.
Absolutely. Yeah. You were talking about the narratives that we hold, and narrative is so built into so many of our identities. I think when it comes to like good examples of that, like the Southern culture is often discussed as a point of conflict in this country, especially with regard to race relations. And I went to school in the South, and this was 20 years ago, and they made us learn to sing Dixie. And I, at that point, I really didn't understand the connotations that people really feel are connected with that song these days. But it's also, a part of cultural pride for a lot of people, and so pointing out the negatives can feel like a denigration. And then also in northern areas where there's a sense of pride about the Great Migration, where lots of Black folks came from the South and got opportunities in the North that they wouldn't have otherwise been able to. But at the same time, in the North, the New York area, the tri-state area, some of the most segregated neighborhoods and schools that you can encounter, right? So there's certainly criticism that can be leveled, in so many different ways, and that feels like a cultural attack.
Absolutely. And I can tell you, even on a personal level, moving here, I've heard so much about, oh, you go into the South in South Carolina, there's a lot of racism and so on. And yeah, there is, but also some of the most generous, helpful people I've met in the United States have been in South Carolina. I've, got a house, didn't even yet have time to do anything, met my neighbor, introduced myself. He knew I'm Arab. He knew I'm, not a white guy. And yet the next day, the HOA were complaining about the grass. I haven't yet lived in the house. The grass was growing tall and all of that. And he went and brought his, mower, and he mowed my grass. And I'm like, why do you do that? And he's like, you're my neighbor. I'm taking care of you. And we talked. He's very, very conservative guy, and we became good friends. We have to be, I think, careful about stereotyping an area, stereotyping a community, stereotyping anybody who's from a certain political group. People are people. They have more than one identity. And I think that often gets lost. If you tell me you are a Democrat or you tell me you are a Republican, suddenly that sums you up as a human being. And there's more to you than that. If you are a Christian, Muslim, or Jewish, you said you're Jewish. That's only one part of who you are. People have so many components that make them who they are. And one of those is not enough. And we get so hang up the moment we hear one of them, and we box them into, well, if he is this, he must be all of this list. And that's never true.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's a great note to end on, because that's definitely a great encapsulation of so much of what we believe at Braver Angels. And so, Aziz, I want to thank you for joining us. It's been great to have you here. And I believe that we're working with Mejdi to offer a free e-chapter from your book, Crossing Boundaries, A Traveler's Guide to World Peace. So hopefully we're going to have that info in the episode notes. And I also wanted to mention that Mejdi had reached out to us because they wanted to discuss collaborating. And we love working with other organizations that share our mission or that have a completely different focus, but still want to support the idea of bringing Americans together for civil discourse to bridge our divide. So to our listeners, if you work for an organization like that, whether it's a nonprofit, a company, an educational institution, a civil or religious organization, we would love to hear from you. So you can go to braverangels.org/braver-partners, and you can submit your interest in becoming a partner organization. And I want to encourage our listeners to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever. And we love your great ratings and reviews as well. And we hope that you've all had a great holiday season. We look forward to seeing you all at our convention in July. So Aziz, thanks again for joining us. This has been great.
Pleasure. Thank you.